The Radio Forest Podcast.
This is Bob.
Bob, this is Forrest in Boise, Idaho. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Doing really good. Calling to talk about your book.
Excellent, excellent.
We've got a couple of things in common. Both of our moms passed away of cancer in 2012 unexpectedly.
Holy shit, really?
Yeah, I've heard you mention it was kind of a midlife crisis or just life-changing. In what way, besides the obvious, did that change how you behave, how you think, or the trajectory of your life?
Yeah, so, bringing it back to kind of even the Duane Allman story, which is kind of where all this genesis is. My mother passed away very suddenly. She had cancer. That's a reassessment, as you know, from your own life. You're like, what the hell am I doing here? I was 40, almost 41. So about that time when you start doing that, so much is summed up in the Allman Brothers song, Ain't Wasting Time No More. The song Greg wrote immediately after Duane died, the first song on Eat a Peach. And that song, Forrest, I'm not lying to you, it always inspires me and has from the first big death I experienced as an adult when my father-in-law committed suicide in 1998. And the first time I got a moment to listen myself was that song and the words, the expression, I am obligated to carry on. I am still here. And, this dream of doing a PhD and of writing a book on the Allman Brothers was something that I had written down in the late 90s and just, had been chipping away at. So finally, mom dying. And again, you probably have had a similar thing. Like, what are the things I haven't accomplished in life? The only reason I haven't is because I haven't. Here we are 10 years later, and you and I are speaking about the result of me making that decision back then.
Bob is the author of Play All Night, the Duane Allman and the Journey to the Fillmore East. It's not really biography about the Allman Brothers, but it's more about that trip ending with the Fillmore East recording and performance. So a couple more things in common real quick. We've both lived in Florida, right? That's where you're from. You spent most of your life there.
Much of until I was about 35. I moved to the South, quote unquote, Nashville from Florida, from what is geographically the South, but acts a little less South, up to, really, truly the deep, the upper South, I guess we call it. Where are you from in Florida?
Well, I'm not from there. My family's from North Carolina, but I spent some time living in Sarasota, so I think the opposite side of Florida view, right? Weren't you on the ocean side? I was on the Gulf side. They're not that far apart.
No, and I lived, Sarasota, which is, where Dickie Betts had his home base for years. Greg was based down there for a long time. That's over directly across the coast from my hometown of Stewart, about 100 miles north of Miami. Both of them sleepier beach towns. I think both of them have continued to see a bunch of growth. But you and I spent time in and around where this story kind of developed and hung around through, from my life in the 70s, years in the 70s, all the way through. Sarasota is a part of this story too, yes.
I was scheming all the time. I'll tell you how I pulled it off. But we both really got into that BMG Columbia House wave. If you just change your name a little bit, you can get another account. So my name is Forrest, so I spelled it with 2 R's. I spelled it with 1 R, and that was enough. I had 2 or 3 accounts going at the same time. I mean, it was awesome to get those many CDs. Yeah. How cool. I mean, it doesn't make sense now with streaming and, even the but the resurgence of record stores. Getting those first, what was it, like 9 CDs for $0.01?
It was so awesome. And you mentioned BMG and Columbia House. So I figured out early that Columbia House had the worst deal because they wanted you to buy like 5 at $20 and up. BMG only wanted you to buy 1. So yeah, that was how a lot of us in the 90s, in college built our CD collections, right? Like CDs were expensive. You could get a whole bunch. And for me, as a voracious consumer of music, it was because things were so cheap, it gave me a lot of room to experiment with finding different CDs and different sounds to learn what was out there. My big one, which was this, me getting this, and I mentioned this in the preface, because I was being cheeky. So I used Fletch, Irwin M. Fletcher, the Chevy Chase character from the movie, who was in college, like we used to watch that movie incessantly. I used to quote it.
It's all ball bearings, guys. Come on.
Oh, ball bearings these days.
Hey!
So if you were clever enough, you could build a hell of a CD collection relatively inexpensively. And like you said, in the streaming era, when I talk and I speak to groups that are multi-age, like understanding the world prior to streaming or prior to internet radio, satellite radio and stuff, it's vastly different, the world we grew up in and the world the Allman Brothers did their stuff, than what we have today. It's vastly different. And thinking about this, like this discussion we're having about the BMG Club, That is not something my children, who are now college students, have any understanding of.
It wouldn't even make sense if you explain it, because it's just like, what was going on? Like, some people don't understand how powerful, quote unquote, Southern rock or grunge or hair metal was, because nothing existed like it before then. So now you're like, man, Nirvana's overrated. There was nothing like that. There was no other way to get that much music that cheap. And also, for me, the stress of picking out something. You only had so many picks. I don't know what this is. I think it looks kind of cool. And they might have had sections like rock or blues. I think this looks cool. But, man, there was nothing worse than taking a gamble and getting a crap CD.
Oh, man, I'll tell you this. When I quit buying CDs for newer bands, quote unquote, was the early 2000s when I realized I was doing just that. I'd read about a band and be like, man, this sounds great. I'd get the CD and I liked one song. Do it again and again. And it's just like, okay, I don't want to spend this money anymore. You're absolutely right. Nowadays, unfortunately, because you can sample everything at all times, I feel like a dieter at an ice cream bar constantly. And I've had to, I'm sure you have too. And by the way, you realize you share a first name with Dickie Betts, right?
Yeah.
Forrest Richard. So I wanted to add that in too, because when you mentioned Forrest, I just wanted to mention that you've got that one going for you.
It's a Southern name, historically for sure.
Yes. So anyway, it was a matter of finding music. BMG made it easier to do. And of course, you read it was a greatest hits album that started all this. The greatest hits were your samplers. Somebody put together the choice cuts of a band. I know every apartment in college, everybody had at least one copy of the Steve Miller Band's greatest hits that we all got from BMG or Columbia House. And every song on it was a banger. You could put that thing on and just drink beer all day and never feel like you were needing anything else.
Oh, it was awesome.
It was great. It was a fun way to do it. Remember the old 5-disc changers and hit random? You had 5 CDs rotating instead of one. And yeah, it's been a fun ride.
That reminds me, my parents had the 5-disc changer, so if my parents were ever gone and I had friends over, oh my God, it was like, oh, let's pick out, you pick one, I pick one, and we'll put it on shuffle.
Yeah.
But a friend of mine, I think he had like a 20-disc changer in his trunk. We would load that sucker up and drive for hours, but if you hit a bump, it would skip, and sometimes it wouldn't unskip, and we'd have to pull over.
Shoot, that's hilarious. Wow.
Last thing in common, and we'll get into the guts of the book. I've actually interviewed quite a few members involved in the story of the Allman Brothers. Derek Trucks. I interviewed Greg Allman when he was coming through Boise, which was awesome. In hindsight, I wish I could have done it again. Just as you get older, you look back on the things you ask and what you did. Don Barnes from 38 Special told me great stories about seeing the Allman Brothers when they were the Allman Joys and also when they were Hourglass. He was like, there was no one better. There was these blonde, skinny, real pale kids, and they just ripped. That was so cool to hear him talk about that. But also, I've talked to Frank Hannon from Tesla quite a bit, married into the family. But with all of that information that I've gathered on my own, I'm not reading stuff I've already known in your book, so kudos to you. I read a ton of rock and roll books. Sometimes you could learn all of this off of Wikipedia. This is not that book, so I don't know the most about the Allman Brothers. Just through my job and what I've been into, I've been lucky enough to put the pieces together. But this is really showing a different side of the band. And I just want to say I appreciate the work that you put into it and also the background and how you're getting to the story, not just of Duane, the namesake of the book, but you also do like, this is how Greg started before they got together. And so I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that was one of the things as I approached it. You were one of the audiences I was thinking about. As a writer, I've been writing for years. This is my 4th book, but this is my first book that most people outside of the history museum business that I work in would read, what we call a monograph in the history profession. I literally thought about it like, as you, and I thought about it first for my fellow hardcore Allman Brothers fans. Like we all know these stories. We tell these stories. They've been published in books. What can I say that's different? And, honestly, the story's the story, right? It's the details I choose to highlight in or whatnot. I'll give you a prime example. Every other book on the Allman Brothers has an extensive chapter on Layla and on what Duane did on Layla. Layla being Eric Clapton's, I think, greatest album. I don't think Clapton has really ever hit that peak again. From my perspective, that album, Derek and the Dominoes, that Duane came in and really set fire to that. There's a lot of stories about that, how he changed this record Duane did of one of his heroes. Eric Clapton was a star when Duane was first playing guitar, from the minute he started playing guitar almost. And so Duane returns this inspiration. And, to me, as I looked at that story, this is just one example of a million. I think the key point in that wasn't that Duane provided this to the great Eric Clapton and now rock an anthem, Layla, that everybody knows, the song and the album, but that Duane turned Eric Clapton down
to join the band
for a job in his band, to go basically drive around in a Winnebago with his friends and make nothing, because it was the Allman Brothers were his band. So getting back to, like you saying, the backstory was important, obviously, the way I structured it, as you can see, because I wanted to share that in Clapton's band, for example, that was a set unit that Duane would be a part of, and he would have made a lot of money and been very successful and played a lot of great music with Eric Clapton. The Allman Brothers were his hand-picked guys. That was all he had, was I still want to go with these guys. The other point, sort of about how much and, versus the other was, I too read a lot of rock books. I've been reading them for years, paying attention to how other people write these stories. I'm not a journalist. I'm not an interviewer. So, I did talk to some of these people, but frankly, most of what they said is in print.
It's out there.
Yeah. So, it's a matter of, for me, finding the quote within that, or the story, the through line that best exemplifies the story for the reader, without assuming your knowledge, whether it be your own interviews or other stuff that you've read. So all to say, I appreciate that you saw that, how I sort of worked that in with the book, because I really did want it to be readable. I knew the hardcores were going to like it. I knew what I had to do to make that happen. Then that sort of more general, casual rock reader, man, I've read all these books too, Forrest, just like you, and some I really like and some I cannot stand. And I just tried to find a voice that I liked, and that was my own within that story.
I also enjoyed how this is the first time I really got the sensation, and you touched on it a little bit a second ago, with him turning down Derek and the Dominoes and Clapton, how Duane really struggled to become a musician, to eventually he's like, that's it. I'm doing my own thing. I can't do this as a session player. I can't be an Hourglass or, the Almond Joys. It's got to be something different, and it's got to be this vision, and I've got to have the right guys.
One of the things about musicians, period, when you look at them, because they are artists, right? They are making music with their instruments. They're making the world more beautiful. And I spend a lot of time around art and artists in the museum world. Artists are pretty, especially when they make the decision to go on their own, right, and to do it, they're very dogged and determined. I don't think Duane necessarily knew the sound. I mean, that's one of those discussions that some of us hardcores will have, is like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? The possibility of the Allman Brothers band, or the Allman Brothers band as he pieced it together? I think it was Duane, like you said, this was his final shot at success. He'd already gone to New York, Nashville, and then LA, as you mentioned, with Hourglass, and failed. And he failed each time because he was trying to fit his thing into this wider music industry. By the time he formed the Allman Brothers, it was his last shot. And he said, no, I want to do it my way and stay in the South. I think that was another really important part of his part of it. When he gets the Clapton offer, they had just released their second album, which was doing terribly. It wasn't, Allman Brothers weren't selling. So he really chose what looked like a losing proposition until they put out At Fillmore East the next year.
How much of the movie Almost Famous do you think is based around the Allman Brothers? I think you mentioned it really quick in the beginning about a Rolling Stone guy traveling with the band, but isn't that basically the plot to Almost Famous? I mean, that's got to be based quite a bit around the Allman Brothers then.
It is. So that general arc of the story, as I understand it, Cameron Crowe toured with the Allman Brothers band, just like that kid does in Almost Famous. He toured with them in 1973. So 2 years after Duane died, a year after-ish after Barry died. That story of trying to get the interview, which he tries to do with Russell Hammond throughout, is a true story. He was trying to get Greg. It's a cover story on Rolling Stone from 1973 that is kind of the basis of the story. And then Cameron Crowe has said, there's elements of stories with the Eagles, with Led Zeppelin. He was around all of that. But the basic story of him going on the road as a young kid, hanging out at the Continental Riot House, the Hyatt House on Sunset, going to these concerts, that was Allman Brothers. There were two big kind of features in Rolling Stone. The one that really pissed the band off forever was the 1971 article by Grover Lewis, which ran in the same issue of Rolling Stone that they ran a little notice about Duane's death. And it was really crappy, basically making fun of them for being Southerners, being kind of hicks. And they were also incredibly drugged out. That many of them went to rehab. All of them got off heroin after that little thing. It's like one of those rock star excess stories that just, made the band upset because their leader had died. But then Almost Famous is a couple years later with a lot of artistic license and liberties taken, but more or less based on his tour. And I think it was like the fall of 73. It's a great piece in Rolling Stone because Cameron Crowe, he's still, I think, pretty young when he writes it, 16, 17 or something. He got it, that's like you get it, like when you talk to somebody who gets it or you read it, you're like, yeah, sort of like my book, I would hope, somebody would be like, yes, this is the kind of book I want to read about this stuff.
I want to verify, you would be the guy to be able to tell me on the cover of at Fillmore East, I believe is it the back cover where it's the shot of the band, or is that the front cover?
Yes,
back cover.
Back cover is the back cover.
Duane is laughing, and he's got his hands crossed. Somebody said that he just scored drugs, and there's a bag of Coke in his hand. That's why they're all laughing at him.
And that's the cover. So the back has the roadies. The front cover has them. Yes, that's the story. So they were sitting there. It was cold. They were being surly. They didn't like to have their picture taken. And Duane sort of jumps up in the middle of it and goes and scores a bag of cocaine or heroin, comes and sits back down, and everybody sort of cracks up. And that is that look you're seeing. From everything I can tell, he did score some drugs, and they all laughed their butts off about it. So I have the picture of the album in the book as a photo, and then I actually have the road case because that's on display at the museum. But I mentioned this little story that you talk about, and the thing I say is, they look like a band who's ready to go, either just came off stage or ready to go on stage. They're really enjoying themselves. They're actually a bunch of guys posing for a picture with their leader having scored some drugs. It's just kind of a funny little backstory when you look at it.
Is that story in the book? I haven't gotten to that part yet then.
It's a photo caption.
Oh, okay. All right. That's why I missed it. Yeah, okay.
One thing I did for your listeners and for you, so I'm a museum guy, and I've built and written exhibit scripts and everything else. So I kind of I had 20 photographs. I think I slid in like 24. My captions, no pun intended, further illustrate the story where I didn't want to put it in text because that story about the drugs is pretty common, as is the back cover where the roadies are, and this whole story about how much they love their roadies. I put that stuff with the photographs. Just here's some more information on the story that doesn't quite fit my narrative yet. So it's in there, but it's kind of packed.
Now I know why I missed it, because this is kind of a weird thing that I do. I can't look at the pictures first. It's like unwrapping the Christmas present too early. I read the entire book, and then I look at all the pictures. So it's like a recap. But I can't learn too much about the story, even though I know what happens with the Allman Brothers, even though I know about Fillmore East.
It's interesting from a fellow fan perspective and reader's perspective. It's always interesting for me to hear about that. Photos for me are weird because I'll go back and forth. Like, okay, who am I looking at? Who am I thinking about kind of thing? I do a lot of that too. But I feel you. And, I put a bunch of playlists together for this book, like to accompany each chapter. And I was like, I don't really know how people approach this stuff. I know when I read a book or come to a new subject musically, I like to immerse myself in the music and the things. But God, there's so much. This well is endless. And so where to begin, where to start, and like you said, like what order? I really like how you're saying it. That's how you approach it. You read the book, then you go back and dig in.
A really good Netflix show will have me pausing it and reading stuff up, whether it's like the new Dahmer. I'm like, wait, is this real? Wait, who's that actor? Yeah. What was he in? Oh, that's cool. Wait, who did he marry? Oh my God, they got divorced. And I got to go back to the movie. It takes me 4 hours to get through a 2-hour movie. But your book, too, it had me pause, and I can't remember the name of the band now because it's early in the book. But Duane plays with this guy and gal, and they've got like a collection of covers, and Duane jumps on with a bunch of other huge stars.
You talking about Motel Shot with Delaney and Bonnie?
Yes, Delaney and Bonnie. That's the one.
Yeah.
So then I was like, I had to pause. I'm like, wait, hang on. I got to go listen to that. Oh, wait. Oh, I didn't realize he was, Wilson Pickett. They did a Wilson Pickett.
Yeah, when you're done listening to Delaney and Bonnie, go listen to Tedeschi Trucks Band, and you're like, there's this correlation between that. I'm staying with my best friend from college this weekend, and He said the same thing about Motel Shot. He goes, I got to go check out that album again, Bob, since you put it in there. These threads of music, you're like, oh, wow, I had not heard Delaney and Bonnie. And then you're like, wow, Delaney and Bonnie played with Eric Clapton? And then it'll remind you, oh, Blind Faith, I haven't listened to that album in years, which is a great record.
I stopped the book and listened to that entire album that Duane hopped on, even though all of the songs except one he wasn't on, thinking of the era and pre-Allman Brothers, and Duane's almost to that spot of like, I got to get these guys together. It's got to have two drummers. It's got to have two lead guitarists. And so I was like, oh, how does that piece fit in? So I was making all these notes while I'm reading. I'm like, oh, listen to Hourglass. Can I find Almond Joy stuff online? Can I find this? Can I find that? So I really like that. Have you checked out, surely the answer is yes, the Allman Betts Band at all?
You know, a little bit. I wanted to like them more than I did. I really like Duane Betts, and I have for years. They are on hiatus, and I don't know if it's a permanent or temporary thing. But I know a lot of my friends really enjoyed it. I'm all for it. Any band that wants to play this music and do it, it's like, let's go. I just want to be a little careful because I don't want somebody to come back at me and go, why don't you love our band kind of thing, you know?
They have fans, and I think they've got no choice. Listening to the story, I listened to a couple interviews of them. It wasn't a thing on purpose like, hey, we should also, I think as kids, they would be aware of each other every 6 months or on the road. And then I think they had their own thing. And then someone's like, you ought to get together. And they did. And they're like, well, this is pretty cool. It's almost like Allman Brothers B-sides. You're like, yeah, it's pretty good. It sounds twangy in that way. And okay, yeah, it's got a Southern feel, but it's not, I wouldn't put it on the greatest hits album.
It's kind of an Allman Brothers light-ish. The sons aren't the fathers. And when you recreate, it's hard, like any team, it's hard to sort of work your little parts out in what you do. So there's a song on this, I think it's the second album, might be their first one, called Autumn Breeze, that Duane Betts sings, and then there's a long instrumental part on it. And I'll tell you what, it reminds me of a 1990s Dickie Betts song. The way Duane Betts carries himself, and he's not the most powerful singer, but neither really was his dad. Dickie was always hitting high notes that were really close to the end of his range. Duane doesn't do that as a singer, and as a guitarist, man, oh my God. And the guy he travels with, Johnny Sticella, who's in Duane's band, is just phenomenal. Holy moly. Music is subjective. Art is subjective. You don't have to like everything. I root for any band in this family and in this orbit because the main band has given me so much. And I like the music. I like the way they approach it, all of them.
How was Tedeschi Trucks? I know you saw them on this tour.
I've seen them 10 times this year. I saw 3 shows in New York City. You know, I would never call them like, oh, this is the Allman Brothers or Spirit of the Allman Brothers. The Tedeschi Trucks band is their own thing 100%. Definitely flavored by Derek's long history with the Allman Brothers and membership in. But it is their own thing. They are just so awesome. I've never left a show of theirs going, I really wish I'd had more of this or more of that. You know, like they're very much like a Delaney and Bonnie or Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishmen, a giant band with multiple ensembles, a horn section, all these different things going on. Duane was trying to increase the size of the Allman Brothers band, even when he was still alive. Well, obviously when he was still alive. His first move was to try and bring in a third drummer, a percussionist. There's a lot of comment from those people in that era that said Duane would have had 10 or 12 people on stage easy if he could have.
It's like Wu-Tang, Slipknot, and the Allman Brothers all have 9 members.
It's basically we're just gonna go out there and we're gonna have so much for you. Ensemble playing like that and playing improvisational ensemble playing at that level. Oh, yeah, it's hard. It's not easy. It takes very special talent. It looks easy, you know, like you got all these people up there like, oh, you can hide in this set, but man, I mean, they're a good band.
But to your point with the Allman Brothers, I think sometimes the radio public or the greatest hits public of the Allman Brothers forgets that at their core, would you agree that they're a jam band? That's what they are.
Oh, yes. I think that's a term we call today. I think that they had argued against that point, but every artist argues with labels. Every single artist, musicians in particular. So, yeah, I mean, they're a progenitor of that, along with the Dead, for sure. Both of them in their own ways, but absolutely they're a jam band, according to what we use today, for sure.
Speaking of live shows, Tedeschi Trucks, how are the Smashing Pumpkins and Jane's Addiction?
Oh, God, that was so awesome. So funny story about that. So I go way back with Jane's and the Pumpkins. Like back when they were new, I was following them around. I was in college. And I have struck up a very unlikely friendship with Jimmy Chamberlain of the Smashing Pumpkins.
Drummer,
because of the drummer. But he he told me that, he goes, I love the Allman Brothers. He goes, one of the first lessons I ever took, my drum teacher wrote out the whipping post drum part on my notebook. He goes, I still have it. So number one, it was a wonderful concert. James and Pumpkins had a really great set. But what was weird to me at first, is no longer weird, was, wait, the Smashing Pumpkins love the Allman Brothers? Because that sound is very different. But when I listen closely to particularly Jimmy's drumming, it is very much cut straight from what's going on in the Allman Brothers. He's just doing it in a harder rock context, in a little tighter arrangement. I'm looking forward to talking to him further on that, because he said to me, he goes, I'm looking forward to reading your book. I'm like, man, I look forward to everything you release on record. So happy to hear that.
Butch Trucks, it just blows my mind that you can be Butch Trucks of the Allman Brothers, and then suicide is even in the equation.
Yeah, I mean, I am a survivor of suicide, so I have all of those same questions in my mind. I'm sure, my wife in particular, with her father and their family, still thinks about it. And I'm certain Butch's family and friends also think the same thing. One of the things that I've heard people close to Butch say is if he had any idea how much he would love. So I can't speak to it honestly, except that the band was off the road. Greg had terminal cancer, because Greg died a couple months later. There was no going back to the Allman Brothers. And he had toured. He put two bands together after the Allman Brothers hung it up. Butch put two bands together with alumni from the Allman Brothers and another one with just him and his son and some others. And they were cooking bands, but they had a hard time selling seats. A drummer in a rock band is kind of anonymous to a certain point, even when you're Butch Trucks. Butch gave his life to the Allman Brothers band. He's buried in Macon, right next to Greg. Duane and Barry have been since early 72.
Didn't Duane and Barry both pass away in Macon?
Yes, both of them died in motorcycle accidents about a year apart, and they're buried together at Rose Hill Cemetery in beautiful above-ground tombs that's now fenced off. And Rose Hill is where, in memory of Elizabeth Reed, was written. Photos from their first album cover, the back cover was at Rose Hill. Real famous spot in Macon, right up against the river. Beautiful, beautiful cemetery.
So you've been and visited the graves and seen them? Is there a lot of people there? Is it kind of like, I've been to Hendrix's, it's kind of like quite a thing, but there's cameras there so they don't deface it. People leave all kinds of crap and try to draw on the graves.
So they had that problem in the 90s with a lot of people would show up. It's nowhere near like a Hendrix or what like Morrison's is over in Paris. It's actually a pretty respectful spot, and you'll see people there regularly. I drove down from Nashville to Florida last week, and I stopped through Macon to see and pay my respects. And fence around it now, and it's pretty classy. Greg spent some money to create a little viewing station. But there were a couple bras hanging from the fence when I was there.
Yeah.
Even in death, the rock star is still attracting the ladies, with their
They're getting more attention dead than I am alive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he is,
it is an Allman, yeah.
I mean, that's a sexy dude.
Yeah. Why do you think, maybe you answered it with Duane still wanting to add more players, two drummers, that's still not a thing.
All right, so several things happen with the two drummers. Derek Trucks does the same thing with his band. He's got two drummers as well. I think Allman Betts did. First of all, it's hard enough to find one drummer who can keep time at that level. And I know this from 40 years of playing music, finding one guy who can consistently stay there, much less two. I think that's one reason you don't have two drummer bands. If you get a good drummer who can do it all or do what you want him to, it's hard to find a second one. The other thing about the Allman Brothers combination is the individual drummers themselves. J-Mo is a very unique drummer who does not necessarily keep time with the standard way that a drummer does, which is like with his left or right foot on the bass drum. He'll play the bass drum notes on all kinds of different things, including cymbals and his toms and everything else. Butch is like a metronome, but not in a bad way. Like he's not a grinder. He just never lost the one. Two things come up. The quick one is Duane was inspired by Otis Redding and James Brown, who toured with two drummers, but neither of them had two drummers play at the same time. They took turns. And the other one is, and I do have this quote in the book, and I love it. It's one of my favorites. Somebody says, "Why two drummers?" And he says, "Well, we knew we were going to be playing a lot, and we couldn't just have one guy, quote, flogging his ass off. It's going to be a lot." And that's true. I mean, those guys are working their four limbs all night. two drummers provides a massive foundation of rhythm and sound on which this entire thing gets built, over the top of. I said in the book, two drummers seems weird only because it seems weird. Almost every drummer starts out in marching band, including J-Mo and Butch, and marching band is ensemble drumming. It makes more sense when you think about it that way, but nobody does it, I think, just because drummers are hard to come by. And so most of the time in that era, you had a rhythm guitarist and a lead guitarist. Another band from this era, Marshall Tucker Band, had George McCorkle played rhythm and Toy Caldwell played lead. It's even in the Beatles, well, they're a bad example because they don't play a lot of lead, but the Rolling Stones in that era was Mick Taylor playing lead and Keith Richards more or less playing rhythm. So you got the hottest guitarist in the land in Duane Allman, along with the hottest guitarist in Florida in Dickie Betts, instead of Duane grabbing some dude who's just going to accompany him and he can just wail all night.
Yeah, you talk about them going back and forth and also respecting each other and even dealing with the jealousy of like, man, this guy is so freaking good. Why am I up here when he's smoking me every night? And they've known each other their entire lives, and they're still like, this is the best damn guitarist I've ever seen, and he's in my band.
Yeah. To me, one of the points that came to me as I read it was Duane Allman was like his own band's biggest fan. And that's pretty cool when your band leader is really all in to that extent with his bandmates and everything else. It shows a lot about him to me that he would have somebody like Dickie in his band that would push him as hard. And Dickie did the same with Warren when Warren joined. Warren Haynes was there to push Dickie Betts, which Dickie wanted back at that point.
What kind of guitars do you currently have? What do you keep around the house, and what do you like to play?
Oh, excellent question. So I have an 83 Strat, Smith Strat, that was my first nice guitar. It's been in my life since, I think, 84 or 85. I've got a Gibson Les Paul Studio that was my younger brother's when he passed away, and I just left it with one of his good friends to practice with and play. I've got a Fender Telecaster. I'm about to get a semi-hollow body 335. I have one rig that I like, which is my Strat. That's my main rig. I got it when I was a Jimi Hendrix kid before I discovered Les Pauls and the Allman Brothers, or I probably would have had a Les Paul. So how about you? What did you say you played?
Yeah, I've got a couple of acoustics. I've got a Flying V. I'm a pretty heavy metal fan, but actually the Flying V love comes from more of an Albert King. Like if you trace the roots of the Flying V, it's a blues guitar, but it's got such a metal image. Yep. Yeah, so I've got a Flying V. I think I've got a Jackson, but it's basically a Strat. It's a Strat copy. I got to take it easy. I'm a sucker for pawn shops and Facebook Marketplace. Anything that's older than me, I really want. But my wish list is a Carina Flying V. That's like $5,000. That's out of the equation. But I'm kicking myself. I actually saw in a pawn shop a Dano Electric, and I wasn't familiar, and I played it, and it was awesome. And I was like, what is this guitar? And then I went down the rabbit hole of like researching that, and I was like, this is awesome. Didn't buy it. Went back. It was sold. A Les Paul Jr. That's my holy grail.
Those are your ones. So I'm looking right now. I had bought an Epiphone 335 years ago, and I just never fell in love with it. I learned how to play slide on it. So I actually just gave it to my friend Troy here where I'm staying in Orlando, and I'm like, that gives me the impetus to go spend a couple, I don't know how much I'll spend, but but now that I don't have the 335 in my house, I can start looking for something else. And I've always loved those big-ass semi-hollow bodies because that was something a lot of guys played in the 60s and 70s when I was coming up and looking at those, the blues guys all played them. And, of course, you and Albert, man, with that Flying V. Oh, that's the first thing I think of with him and then Randy Rhoads on the cover of the tribute album. I think.
Yeah, I actually talked to Joe Bonamassa, and I was like, true or false, Steven Seagal has Albert King's Flying V. And he goes, true. He has 3 of them. He's got 3 Flying Vs of Albert King's. Steven Seagal has.
Wow.
He's got a massive guitar collection. He's a huge blues fan. He plays the blues. That blows my mind.
The Stax Museum is one of my clients out in Memphis, and they've got a purple Flying V that Billy Gibbons gave Albert. With those guitars, it's really, I've spent a decent amount of time in this in my professional life with museums. To the artists, to the guitarists themselves, for the most part, the guitars really are very interchangeable to them, for the most part. A lot of these guys at the Stax Museum, Jeff, the director there, has told me, that the guys who played the instruments on, the theme from Shaft, for example, he thinks nothing of the guitar he used that on because he's replaced it 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's just so funny how you and I, Steven Seagal, Joe Bonamassa, we hang on to these instruments that are somebody else's. And to them, how many Lucille's are there? Yeah. B.B. King named every guitar he touched Lucille, not just, I have a Strat called Starla after the Pumpkin song. That's it. I got one Strat,
Yeah. But you talk about like those big hollow body guitars, I instantly think of, and you're down in Florida now, I think of Tom Petty, even though he played all kinds of stuff, but I think of that big, massive guitar. I can picture Tom Petty holding it.
That's the sound of that era. And, it's interesting. Petty, fellow Floridian, but he's an expatriate. He went out to L.A. My first talk last week was in Gainesville, and he was at some of those Almond Joy shows. I might even have a quote from him in there.
You have stuff in there about him running across the Allman Brothers. I think maybe Greg or maybe both of them.
That quote you had from the guy from 38 Special. I have Gary Rossington similarly says, we were just little fat high school boys.
We looked like baseball players. They had long hair and they were skinny.
And that is a real thread throughout them is like these guys were the real deal, because they were a couple years. If they weren't a couple years older, they had got taken to the road before anybody else did.
It's Bob Beatty. He's got a brand new book out, Play All Night, Duane Allman and the Journey to Fillmore East. It's not live at Fillmore East. It's the Allman Brothers Band at Fillmore East.
At Fillmore East, which is, honestly, everybody, I'm sure the band even messes up that name, but it's that's what the spray paint on JMO's road case said, the Allman Brothers Band at Fillmore East. It was a weekend of sessions. It wasn't a single show, and I think that's one thing to remember is, in today's day and age, we get every show automatically. You can. And these guys picked 6 or 7 songs. They picked the versions they wanted from a weekend of shows. No overdubs. That's the part that just really blows me away.
I hadn't realized, because you grow up with albums like that, I stopped thinking about how much they manipulate crowd noise. They'll go in and redo a solo. Some bands, not everybody. Some of my favorite live albums in the past 10 years, I found out later, oh, why didn't it come out right away? Oh, because they went back in and edited it. I'm like, no, because I think of the jam bands like the Grateful Dead and Allman Brothers Live. Look at what they did before that technology.
Yeah, and, the Dead did it on their second live record, which is it's just called The Grateful Dead. But on Live Dead, they didn't do it. Their first live album came out in '68. But listen, the joke is the only thing on it that was live was the crowd. And, when you listen to if you listen to Get Your Yayas Out, which comes out, I think, the year before, I think it came out in '70, that is mixed like a concert. Like, I used to think that was the Rolling Stones live in concert. And then it turns out all those songs are from different shows, and they faded the noise in to make it sound like a concert, and then they did some overdubs.
Yeah.
That's really common. I think the Allman Brothers expected to do that in post. They just their playing didn't need it.
Well, Bob, thank you for the chat today. The book is out now. I believe there's a digital version also on paperback. Amazon, right? Or is there anything else that you want to promote?
It's on Amazon. I am on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Long Live the ABB, which is I'm just posting Allman Brother content and related. So if you want to get involved in the discussion, I am on the web at FillmoreEastBook.com. You can reach me. There's no detail too small that I will not discuss with somebody in this book. I put a lot of thought into all of these little details for people like us. And that includes hardcore fans and minimal fans and just people who understand Southern history or care about it, that sort of stuff, or history in general, music history. Get in touch.
I appreciate your fandom. I appreciate your research. I appreciate your book. I've read a lot of books. I've read a lot of shitty books this year. Yours is not a shitty book. Bob, thanks for the chat today.
Thanks. Appreciate it very much. And I'll be in Boise probably next fall for the first time. Let's stay in touch.
Yeah, when you come out here, I know a local guy. He builds all the guitars for Billy Gibbons. Billy Gibbons flies into Boise, Idaho. So the fuzzy guitars, the Strats that have a wallpaper motif, those are made here in Boise, Idaho, along with Steve Miller's guitars. And he'll do custom guitars, too, for, I think the last time was Peter Frampton. Frampton wanted to do a surprise for Steve Miller, and so we'll go tour his shop. We'll chat with him. He's done guitars for the Rolling Stones, but he's Billy Gibbons' guy.
Badass.
We'll stop by his shop, and I'll give you a little tour around. It'll blow your mind.
Right on. And listen, thank you for, just being so engaged. When you do this kind of stuff, it's a lonely process until you start talking about it. So talking about the book with people who actually read it and appreciate it, it's just like I could do this forever. So, I appreciate you taking the time and I looked it up. A very thin history in Boise, like 3 shows. The first one in 81. This is music that touches all of us. So I'm very grateful. Thank you for stopping to talk to me today.
I'll be in touch for when you come through Boise.
Be well.